The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at RAF Bryce Norton as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood quietly beside her husband. The wind caught her navy coat and she pulled it tighter around herself, not from cold but from the weight of what was about to happen. Prince William was preparing for a solo deployment to the Falkland Islands, a routine mission that would separate them for 6 weeks, the longest they had been apart since their wedding day. The couple had arrived early, hoping for a few precious moments away from the cameras and crowds. But even at this military base, their presence had not gone unnoticed. Ground crew members worked nearby, occasionally stealing glances at the royal couple who seemed lost in their own world. Catherine's usually perfect composure showed tiny cracks, the way she fidgeted with her wedding ring, the slight tremor in her hands as she reached up to adjust William's collar one final time. William, dressed in his RAF uniform, carried himself with the practiced dignity expected of his rank, but those who knew him well could see the reluctance in his movements. This was not just any goodbye. This was a husband leaving his wife, a father departing from his young children, and a man uncertain about what lay ahead in one of the most remote corners of the world. The helicopter that would take him to his transport plane sat waiting, its rotors still but ready. The sight of it seemed to make everything real in a way that all their private conversations had not. Catherine's eyes lingered on the aircraft, perhaps imagining the moment it would lift off and carry away the most important person in her world. Other military families nearby were going through their own farewells, but none carried the additional burden of knowing their goodbye would soon be broadcast to millions around the globe. The media had been kept at a respectful distance, but their telephoto lenses were already trained on the couple, waiting for that perfect shot that would capture a nation's attention. As they stood together in those final moments, neither William nor Catherine spoke much. They had said their real goodbye in private, away from prying eyes. This public farewell was for duty, for the cameras, for the people who expected to see their future king and queen handling separation with grace and dignity. But beneath the surface, two people who had built their entire adult lives around each other were struggling with the reality of being apart. The wind picked up slightly, causing Catherine to brush a strand of hair from her face. It was a simple human gesture that somehow made her seem more relatable to the watching world. Here was a woman, royal title aside, facing the same fears and uncertainties that military wives across the country knew all too well. The difference was that her moment of vulnerability would be captured, analyzed, and remembered long after William returned home. A senior officer approached them, signaling that it was time. The formal part of the goodbye was about to begin, but first there would be this moment, unscripted, unplanned, and ultimately unforgettable. Catherine took a small step closer to her husband, her hand finding his. For just a second, the rest of the world fell away, and there were simply two people who loved each other saying goodbye. The cameras caught it all, the way William's thumb gently traced across Catherine's knuckles, the slight nod she gave him as if to say she would be strong while he was gone, the moment when they both seemed to take a deeper breath before facing what came next. It was intimate and public all at once, a contradiction that defined so much of their lives. Behind them, other families were completing their own farewells, children clinging to fathers, wives wiping away tears they had promised not to shed. The prince and princess were part of this larger tapestry of military life, yet separate from it by virtue of who they were and what their goodbye would come to represent. As the moment stretched on, both William and Catherine seemed aware that this was more than just a personal goodbye. It was becoming something larger, a symbol of sacrifice and duty that would resonate far beyond the confines of this military base. The weight of that responsibility sat alongside their personal emotions, making an already difficult moment even more complex. The officer waited patiently, understanding that some things could not be rushed even for royalty. This was one of those moments when the human side of their story took precedence over protocol and schedule. Soon enough, the formal goodbye would begin, but for now, there was just a husband and wife, holding hands in the morning sun, gathering strength for the separation that lay ahead. The formal goodbye began with military precision, but the emotion beneath the surface was impossible to hide. William stepped back slightly, creating the proper distance for the official farewell, yet his eyes never left Catherine's face. She lifted her chin in that characteristic way she had when trying to project strength, but the slight moisture in her eyes betrayed the effort it was taking. A small group of senior officers and dignitaries had gathered to witness the departure. Among them were other military wives who understood exactly what Catherine was experiencing, regardless of her royal status. Some had been through this ritual dozens of times, yet they watched with sympathy, recognizing the universal nature of military goodbye. Whether you were a princess or a private's wife, the wind had picked up considerably, and Catherine's hair whipped around her face as she tried to maintain her composure. William reached out instinctively to smooth a strand behind her ear, a gesture so natural and tender that it stopped conversations around them. The cameras captured the moment from multiple angles, but none could fully convey the gentleness of his touch or the way her eyes closed briefly at his contact. Children from other military families nearby had stopped their own activities to watch the royal couple. They whispered among themselves, pointing at the beautiful lady in the navy coat and the prince in his uniform. Their innocent curiosity added another layer to the scene. Here was a moment that would become part of their own memories of military life, a reminder that even princes and princesses were not immune to the sacrifices required by service. Catherine's private secretary stood at a respectful distance, occasionally checking her watch but making no move to hurry the proceedings. She had worked with the princess long enough to know that this moment could not be rushed, that the human element of the story was just as important as any scheduled appointment that might follow. The helicopter pilot had completed his pre-flight checks and was waiting patiently, understanding that his passengers today carried more than the usual cargo. This flight would begin a journey that would separate one of the world's most watched couples, and the responsibility of that began with him. As William prepared to speak his formal farewell, Catherine reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. It was clearly personal, perhaps a letter to be opened during the long flight ahead, or maybe a photograph of their children to keep close during the weeks of separation. She pressed it into his hand and he closed his fingers around it immediately, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The exchange was brief but profound. In that small envelope was everything they could not say in public, all the private words and promises that would sustain them through the separation. William slipped it into his uniform pocket over his heart, a gesture that was not lost on the watching cameras or the crowd. Other military personnel began to move toward their own aircraft and duties, but many lingered, drawn by the human drama unfolding before them. There was something compelling about watching two people who seemed to have everything still struggle with the basic human experience of saying goodbye. Catherine's hands were clasped in front of her now, a formal posture that contrasted sharply with the emotional turbulence visible in her expression. She was trying to be the perfect military wife, the supportive partner who sends her husband off with confidence and strength. But the cost of that performance was written clearly on her face. The media representatives, kept at a distance but close enough to capture the scene, worked quietly but efficiently. They understood they were witnessing something special, not just a royal departure, but a moment of genuine human emotion that would resonate with people around the world. The challenge was capturing it respectfully, telling the story without intruding on the privacy of the moment. A young airman nearby watched the scene with particular interest. He had joined the RAF partly inspired by Prince William's service, and seeing his future king saying goodbye to his wife made the realities of military life suddenly very real. The glamour of royal life could not protect them from the sacrifices that every military family understood. The formal speeches began, brief but necessary acknowledgments of duty and service. But even as the official words were spoken, all eyes remained on William and Catherine, waiting for that final moment when the goodbye would become real, when the helicopter would start its engines and the separation would truly begin. Catherine listened to each word, but her focus remained on her husband's face, memorizing details that would have to sustain her through the weeks ahead. The way his uniform fit perfectly, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the exact shade of his eyes in the morning light. These details would become precious during the lonely evenings ahead. The helicopter engines began their warm-up sequence, filling the air with a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through everyone present. The sound was both familiar and ominous, familiar to those who lived military life daily, ominous because it marked the beginning of the end of this goodbye. Catherine's shoulders tensed slightly at the noise, her body instinctively responding to what it meant. William turned toward the aircraft, then back to his wife, as if torn between duty and desire. His training told him it was time to go, but every personal instinct urged him to stay just a little longer. The conflict was visible in his posture, the straight shoulders of an officer at war with the slight forward lean of a husband reluctant to leave. The ground crew moved with practiced efficiency around them, performing the final checks and preparations. Their movements were respectful but purposeful, understanding that royal or not, goodbyes could not last forever. The aircraft had a schedule to keep, and other personnel were waiting for transport to their own deployments. Catherine watched the crew work, perhaps trying to distract herself from the growing reality of the situation, but her eyes kept returning to William, cataloging every detail of this moment. Later, when people asked her about this day, she would remember not just the emotional weight of it, but these smaller details. The way the morning light caught his uniform buttons, the sound of his boots on the tarmac, the scent of jet fuel mixing with his cologne. A senior officer approached William with a clipboard, requiring his signature on final deployment documents. Even in this personal moment, the administrative requirements of military life intruded. Catherine stepped back slightly to give them space, but her eyes never left her husband's face as he handled the paperwork with efficient professionalism. Other families nearby were reaching their own final moments. A young wife with 2 small children was saying goodbye to her husband, her own tears flowing freely now that the formal part was over. Catherine glanced toward them with obvious sympathy, recognizing a kindred spirit in another woman facing separation from the man she loved. The children from various military families had grown bolder in their watching, some even approaching close enough to wave shyly at the royal couple. Catherine managed a small smile and waved back, her natural warmth with children evident even in this difficult moment. One little girl, perhaps 4 years old, broke free from her mother's grasp and ran up to Catherine with a dandelion picked from the nearby grass. The spontaneous gift seemed to catch Catherine off guard, but she accepted it gracefully, bending down to the child's level to thank her properly. The moment provided a brief respite from the intensity of the goodbye, a reminder that life and innocence continued even in the midst of difficult partings. William watched this interaction with obvious affection, seeing his wife's natural grace even under pressure. The helicopter pilot signaled that it was time for final boarding. The moment everyone had been both anticipating and dreading had arrived. William looked toward his wife one last time as a civilian, knowing that once he boarded that aircraft, he would become fully a serviceman again, with all the duties and distances that entailed. Catherine straightened her coat one final time, a gesture that seemed more about composing herself than about her appearance. She had prepared for this moment, practiced being strong, but the reality was proving more difficult than she had anticipated. Still, she managed to keep her chin up, determined to send her husband off with confidence rather than worry. The media representatives readied their equipment for what they sensed would be the most powerful images of the day. The technical aspects of their job required attention, but many of them were also moved by what they were witnessing. This was the kind of human story that transcended celebrity or royalty. It was simply about love and loss and the sacrifices made by those who serve. William took a step toward the helicopter, then paused. This hesitation was not about protocol or procedure. It was purely personal. Every husband who had ever faced deployment would recognize that moment of pause. The internal struggle between duty and desire, between what you must do and what you want to do. The wind continued to gust across the tarmac, and Catherine's coat billowed around her as she stood waiting for whatever would come next. She seemed smaller somehow in that moment, not physically but emotionally, as if the approaching separation was already beginning to diminish her in some way. William's fellow officers waited respectfully, understanding that this was his moment to navigate as he saw fit. They had all been through similar goodbyes, and they knew that rushing this part would serve no one well. The mission would wait these few extra minutes for the completion of something far more important than any schedule. The moment had arrived when words were no longer enough, when all the preparations and mental rehearsals gave way to pure emotion. William stepped closer to Catherine, closing the formal distance that protocol had demanded. His hands found hers, and for a moment they simply stood looking at each other, communicating in the silent language that couples develop over years of shared experience. Catherine's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the morning, finally began to crack. A single tear escaped and traced its way down her cheek. catching the light and the attention of every camera present. She made no move to wipe it away, perhaps understanding that this moment of authentic emotion was more powerful than any attempt at stoic perfection. William's thumb gently brushed the tear from her face, a gesture so tender and natural that it stopped conversations throughout the area. The intimacy of the moment created a bubble around them, making everyone else feel like witnesses to something sacred. Even the most experienced photographers found themselves holding their breath, reluctant to break the spell with the click of their shutters. The helicopter engines grew louder, demanding attention and action. But in this moment, the machinery of departure seemed less important than the human connection playing out on the tarmac. Other personnel moved quietly around them, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the mission details were forgotten. Catherine found her voice, though it was barely audible above the aircraft noise. Those nearby who managed to hear her words would later report that she simply said, "Come home to me." But the way she said it carried the weight of every promise and prayer that military spouses had ever whispered at moments like this. The simplicity of the words made them more powerful than any elaborate speech could have been. William nodded, his own voice tight with emotion as he replied, "Always." It was a promise that every departing service member made, knowing that circumstances beyond their control might prevent them from keeping it, but making it anyway because love demanded such promises, regardless of uncertainty. The young airman who had been watching from nearby found himself thinking of his own girlfriend back home, suddenly understanding the weight of the commitments he was making by choosing military service. The royal couple's goodbye was teaching him something about the real cost of duty that no training manual had ever conveyed. Catherine reached up to straighten William's collar one final time, her fingers lingering against the fabric longer than necessary. It was a gesture both practical and symbolic, the last wifely touch before he became fully a serviceman again. Her hands trembled slightly as she performed this small ritual, and William covered her hands with his own, steadying them and himself. The pilot appeared at the helicopter door, not to rush them but to signal that the final moment had truly arrived. His presence was respectful but unmistakable. Duty was calling, and it could not be ignored much longer. William acknowledged him with a brief nod, understanding the message while still needing these last few seconds with his wife. Around them, the military base continued its operations, but at a more subdued pace. Everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not because of who was involved, but because of what was happening. Love and loss, duty and sacrifice. These universal themes played out daily on military bases worldwide, but rarely with such visible emotion. Catherine took a small step back, creating space for William to move toward his departure, while still maintaining their connection. Her posture straightened and she lifted her chin in preparation for the final moment. She was drawing on reserves of strength she had been building throughout their relationship, preparing to be the supportive military wife while her heart was breaking. The media representatives captured every nuance of the exchange, but many found themselves moved beyond their professional obligations. This was the kind of story that reminded them why they had chosen journalism. Not for scandal or sensation, but for moments of authentic human experience that connected with people across all boundaries. William began to move toward the helicopter, his steps slow and deliberate. Each footstep on the tarmac seemed to echo with finality, marking the transition from husband to serviceman, from personal time to professional duty. But he turned back repeatedly, unable to complete the separation cleanly. Catherine remained stationary, understanding that following him would only make the goodbye more difficult. Instead, she became his fixed point, the image he would carry with him during the weeks ahead. Her strength in that moment, standing alone but not defeated, would become the defining image of this departure for everyone who witnessed it. The wind picked up again, causing Catherine's coat to billow dramatically around her. The natural drama of the moment seemed to underscore the emotional weight of what was happening. Even the weather appeared to be participating in this farewell, adding its own emphasis to an already powerful scene. William reached the helicopter door and paused, his hand on the frame as he turned for what both he and Catherine knew would be their final look at each other before separation. The distance between them was only 20 feet, but it might as well have been 20,000 miles for how impossible it suddenly seemed to cross. His uniform, which had looked so sharp and professional throughout the morning, now seemed like armor that was protecting him from his own emotions. Catherine raised her hand in a small wave, a gesture that appeared casual but carried enormous weight. Her fingers moved slowly as if she were trying to hold on to the moment for as long as possible. The wave was captured by dozens of cameras, but none could convey the effort it took for her to keep her hand steady, or the way her wedding ring caught the light as she moved. The helicopter crew moved with quiet efficiency around William, checking equipment and preparing for departure. Their professionalism provided a counterpoint to the emotional drama, a reminder that military operations continued regardless of personal feelings. Yet even these seasoned servicemen seemed affected by what they were witnessing, moving with unusual gentleness around their royal passenger. Other military families nearby had completed their own goodbyes and were beginning to disperse, but many lingered to watch this final scene. There was something compelling about seeing their own experiences reflected in the lives of people they usually only saw in newspapers or on television. The universality of military separation had never been more clearly demonstrated. A young mother holding a baby stepped closer to Catherine, offering the silent support that military spouses provided each other without words. Catherine acknowledged her with a grateful nod, understanding that in this moment rank and title meant nothing compared to shared experience. They were simply two women watching their husbands leave for dangerous deployments. The helicopter pilot began his final pre-flight announcements, his voice crackling over the radio system. The technical language of aviation created a stark contrast to the emotional scene playing out nearby. Phrases like flight plan approved and weather conditions acceptable seemed to belong to a different world than the one where a wife was saying goodbye to her.
Husband, William secured his gear and took his seat.
But his attention remained focused outside the aircraft window where Catherine stood. The plexiglass created a barrier between them now, adding another layer of separation to the physical distance. He pressed his palm against the window, and Catherine understood the gesture, pressing her own hand to her heart in response. The engines began to increase their power, creating a whirlwind of dust and debris around the aircraft. Catherine stepped back to a safe distance but never took her eyes off the helicopter. Her hair whipped around her face in the rotor wash, and she had to hold her coat tightly to prevent it from billowing uncontrollably, but she remained steady and focused. Ground crew members moved quickly to remove the final safety equipment and clear the landing area. Their movements were practiced and efficient, but they too seemed affected by the emotional weight of this particular departure. Several were seen exchanging glances that suggested they understood they were participating in something that would be remembered long after routine. Deployments were forgotten. The little girl who had given Catherine the dandelion earlier broke free from her mother again and ran toward the princess, shouting something that was lost in the noise of the engines. Catherine knelt down to receive whatever message the child was trying to convey, creating a poignant image of grace under pressure that would become one of the most shared photographs of the day. Other military personnel gathered at respectful distances, forming an informal honor guard for the departure. Their presence was both professional and personal, colleagues supporting a fellow serviceman, but also witnesses to a moment that transcended military protocol. Some stood at attention, others in more relaxed poses, but all were clearly moved by what they were seeing. The helicopter began to lift slowly off the ground, each foot of altitude adding to the finality of the separation. Catherine tilted her head back to maintain eye contact with William as long as possible, her hand still raised in that gentle wave. The aircraft's ascent seemed to happen in slow motion, as if time itself was reluctant to complete this goodbye. As the helicopter gained altitude, the figures inside became smaller and less distinct, but Catherine continued to watch until she could no longer make out individual shapes. Her hand remained raised even after rational thought suggested that William could no longer see her, as if the gesture itself was keeping some connection alive across the growing distance. The rotor noise began to fade as the aircraft moved away from the base, replaced by the normal sounds of military operations resuming. But for those who had witnessed the departure, the silence felt profound. Something significant had ended, and the return to routine activities seemed almost surreal after the intensity of the previous hour. Catherine finally lowered her hand and allowed her shoulders to relax slightly. The performance was over, the duty completed, but the reality of separation was just beginning. She stood alone on the tarmac, no longer a wife saying goodbye but a woman beginning the long wait for her husband's return. The helicopter disappeared into the morning sky, becoming first a distant speck and then nothing at all, leaving Catherine standing alone on the tarmac, with only the memory of rotors and the lingering scent of aviation fuel. The sudden silence felt overwhelming after the mechanical noise that had dominated the last few minutes. She remained motionless for several moments, staring at the empty sky as if willing the aircraft to return. Around her, military life slowly resumed its normal pace. Ground crews began preparing for the next scheduled operations. Families finished their own goodbyes and started to leave, and the urgency that had surrounded the royal departure began to dissipate. But Catherine seemed frozen in time, reluctant to take the first step away from the place where she had last seen her husband. Her private secretary approached cautiously, understanding that this transition needed to happen gently. There were no pressing appointments that couldn't wait a few more minutes, and the wisdom of experience told her that rushing this moment would serve no one well. Catherine needed these minutes to process what had just happened and prepare for the weeks ahead. The young mother with the baby who had stood near Catherine during the goodbye approached tentatively. "Your Royal Highness," she said quietly. "It doesn't get easier, but it does get more manageable." The words were simple, but carried the weight of multiple deployments and countless goodbyes. Catherine turned toward her with genuine gratitude, recognizing the gift of shared understanding. Media representatives began to pack their equipment, but many continued to watch Catherine with respectful interest. They had captured the dramatic moments of the goodbye, but this aftermath was equally compelling. The solitary figure in the navy coat, standing alone where moments before there had been two, told its own powerful story about the cost of military service. The little girl who had given Catherine the dandelion appeared at her side again, tugging gently on her coat. When Catherine looked down, the child pointed to the sky and said, "He'll come back. My daddy always comes back." The innocent confidence in her voice seemed to penetrate Catherine's emotional fog, bringing the first genuine smile she had managed since the helicopter lifted off. Other military spouses began to gather around Catherine, not intrusively but supportively. They understood the unique challenges she would face in the coming weeks, maintaining public composure while dealing with private worry, supporting the families of other deployed personnel while managing her own concerns, representing strength and stability while feeling anything but strong or stable. Catherine's phone buzzed with what was certainly the first of many messages she would receive throughout the day. Messages of support, requests for statements, scheduling adjustments, all the administrative demands that would help fill the empty hours ahead. But for now she ignored the device, needing these few more minutes of quiet reflection. The base commander approached to offer his personal assurances about William's safety and the mission's importance. His words were professional and comforting, but Catherine seemed more focused on the human connection than the official reassurances. She had heard similar briefings before and would hear them again. What mattered now was the community of support surrounding her. Ground crew members who had worked around the helicopter during the goodbye began to approach, offering their own simple words of support. These men and women who dealt with military departures as routine parts of their job had clearly been moved by what they had witnessed. Their acknowledgement of the day's emotional weight validated Catherine's own feelings about the difficulty of the goodbye. The wind continued to gust across the tarmac, and Catherine finally began to walk slowly toward the waiting car that would take her back to her official duties. Each step seemed to require conscious effort, as if her body was reluctant to begin the journey away from this place of departure. Her movements were graceful but deliberate, those of someone transitioning between one phase of life and another. As she reached the vehicle, Catherine turned back toward the sky one more time. The helicopter was long gone, but the gesture seemed necessary, a final acknowledgement of what had just occurred and what lay ahead. Her driver waited patiently, understanding that this moment could not be rushed or abbreviated according to anyone else's timeline. The little girl who had befriended Catherine during the morning ran up to the car window as it prepared to leave. She pressed her small palm against the glass, and Catherine responded by placing her own hand on the inside of the window, creating a connection across the barrier. The child's mother called her back. but not before this final exchange that seemed to symbolize the continuing bonds that military families maintained across distance and separation. As the car began to move away from the base, Catherine watched the familiar buildings and aircraft diminish in the rear window. This place would hold special significance now, not just as a military installation, but as the location where she had said the most difficult goodbye of her married life. The memory of these moments would be forever tied to this landscape of runways and hangars. The outside world awaited her return, official duties, public appearances, the careful management of royal responsibilities while privately counting the days until William's return. But the woman who left RAF Bryce Norton that morning was subtly different from the one who had arrived just a few hours earlier. She had been tested by separation and found reserves of strength she hadn't known existed. 6 weeks later, Catherine stood in almost exactly the same spot on the RAF Bryce Norton tarmac. But everything felt different. The morning sun cast familiar shadows. The wind carried the same sense of aviation fuel and fresh air. But the woman waiting for her husband's return had been transformed by the experience of separation. She was stronger now, more confident in her ability to handle whatever challenges military life might bring. The weeks had passed slowly but productively. Catherine had thrown herself into royal duties with renewed purpose, understanding more deeply the sacrifices made by military families across the Commonwealth. Her public appearances had carried new authenticity, informed by personal experience of what it meant to worry about someone serving far from home. The empathy in her voice when meeting other military spouses was no longer theoretical, but deeply felt. The media attention surrounding William's return was even more intense than his departure had been. The images of their emotional goodbye had resonated around the world, making their reunion a story that transcended royal watching or military news. People who had been moved by their farewell were invested in seeing how the story would end, eager to witness love triumph over separation. Other families waited nearby for their own returning servicemen and women, creating an atmosphere of shared anticipation and joy. Children clutched homemade welcome signs. Spouses checked their appearance one final time, and the air buzzed with excitement that was almost tangible. Catherine found herself part of this community in a way she had never been before, united by the common experience of military separation. The helicopter appeared as a distant speck on the horizon, growing larger as it approached the base. Catherine's heart began to race as she strained to make out details of the aircraft, knowing that somewhere inside was the man she had missed more than she had thought possible. The weeks of maintaining composure in public while privately counting days were about to end. As the helicopter touched down, ground crews moved quickly to secure the aircraft and prepare for passenger disembarkation. Catherine found herself taking unconscious steps forward, drawn by the proximity of reunion but held back by protocol and the knowledge that she needed to wait for the proper moment. The internal struggle between public dignity and private longing played out in her posture and expression. William appeared in the helicopter doorway, scanning the crowd until his eyes found Catherine. Even across the distance and despite the formal nature of his arrival, the connection between them was immediate and powerful. He looked tired from the long journey and the weeks of service, but his smile when he saw his wife was radiant and genuine. The formal part of the return proceeded quickly. Brief speeches of welcome, acknowledgments of successful mission completion, and the administrative requirements that bookended military deployments. But everyone present understood that the real story was happening in the glances exchanged between the prince and princess, in the visible effort both were making to maintain proper protocol while longing to simply embrace. When the official ceremonies concluded and William was finally free to move toward his wife, the crowd fell silent in anticipation. The cameras focused intently on the approaching reunion, but many of the photographers found themselves moved by what they were witnessing. This was the completion of a story that had touched people around the world, the happy ending that everyone had been hoping for. Catherine waited until William was just a few steps away before moving toward him. When they finally embraced, the emotion was overwhelming. Relief, joy, love, and the pure satisfaction of being together again after weeks of separation. The hug lasted longer than protocol usually allowed, but no one seemed inclined to interrupt such an obviously genuine moment. "I missed you," Catherine whispered, words that were meant only for William, but were lip-read by cameras and shared with the world. His response was equally simple and heartfelt: "I'm home." The exchange was brief but perfect, capturing everything that needed to be said about love, commitment, and the completion of duty. The little girl who had befriended Catherine during the goodbye appeared again, this time with a fresh dandelion for both the prince and princess. The gesture provided a perfect bridge between the sadness of departure and the joy of return, a symbol of continuity and hope that would be remembered long after the formal aspects of the day were forgotten. As they walked together toward the waiting car, William and Catherine seemed reluctant to separate even by the few inches that proper walking would require. Their hands remained clasped, their steps synchronized, and their attention focused entirely on each other despite the crowds and cameras surrounding them. The magnetic pull that had been interrupted by duty was finally restored. The drive away from the base was quiet, but content. Catherine rested her head on William's shoulder, finally allowing herself to fully relax for the first time in 6 weeks. The formal requirements had been met, the public duties completed, and now they could simply be a couple reunited after a difficult separation. Later, when historians and biographers would write about this period in their lives, they would focus on the symbolic importance of the goodbye and reunion, the way it represented the balance between personal sacrifice and public duty that defined modern royal life. But for William and Catherine, the story was much simpler. It was about love tested by separation and strengthened by reunion, about discovering that their bond could survive the challenges that military service would inevitably bring to their marriage, and about the power of human connection to transcend duty, distance, and time.